1941, the owners of the simple structure on Hollywood's Fairfax Avenue served as the keeper of the flame for celluloid silent classics. But on the night of January 17, 1997, the quaint little cinema was the scene that would appear to be a robbery gone awry. When it was over, the theater's 74-year-old owner, Laurence Austin, was dead, the victim of multiple bullet wounds.
It was the most unlikely murder. It was so botched.
And everybody was like, shot and murdered? What happened? What's going on?
On this episode of Mysteries and Scandals, we'll tell you a story of greed, murder, and deception lurking just beyond the facade of a tiny silent movie theater.
The financial abuse aspect of the case would have never come to the forefront except for the homicide investigation.
We'll also see how the initial inquest led to shocking revelations about the victim and his companion, James Van Sickle.
Mr. Van Sickle, according to that holographic will, was going to inherit everything.
And you'll see how the man who planned the crime hid in plain sight by granting numerous television interviews.
We're confident that this individual will be caught and taken off the street.
Throughout all of these, he said he was committed to finding the murderer.
I'm A.J. Benza. The love of movies collides with the lust for money as we solve the murder at the silent movie theater. On a quiet winter evening in 1997, movie buffs were enjoying an animated short before the feature presentation at Hollywood's silent movie theater. Without warning, the silence was broken by gunfire in the theater's lobby. LAPD detective Alan Hamilton.
A suspect entered and purchased a ticket and entered the auditorium and watched for approximately 30 minutes the screening. The suspect returned to the cashier area and announced a robbery and produced a handgun. The suspect then pointed the handgun directly at the head of Mr. Austin and fired one shot at point-blank range. He then fired additional shots, and then he ran through the auditorium, down an aisle, firing more shots over the head of the patrons and out a back door to a waiting vehicle.
When the smoke cleared, 74-year-old owner Laurence Austin was dead, and a 17-year-old concession worker was severely wounded. Ron Russell is a reporter for New Times, a weekly newspaper in Los Angeles.
The response was disbelief. Who would want to kill this benevolent old fellow? It just did not smell right from the beginning.
No, it didn't. But to really understand what happened that January night, we got to go back to the beginning of the silent movie theater. This tiny movie house in Los Angeles was actually the dream of a man from Oklahoma named John Hampton. As a young man, Hampton started collecting silent movies wherever he could find them. But when Oklahoma became a dust bowl in the 1930s, Hampton and his wife decided to make a move. Dorothy Hampton explained why in this 1991 interview.
Well, my husband and I moved from Oklahoma out here, and he had always worked around film exchange and loved the old films and that sort of thing.
John Hampton bought a piece of land on Fairfax Avenue in Hollywood and then built his dream, the silent movie theater. John and Dorothy lived in a small apartment upstairs, right next to the theater's projection booth.
From 1941 until 1979, John and Dorothy operated the theater. It had fallen into disrepair for many of those years, the 60s, 70s, until 1979 when they closed it temporarily to go back to Oklahoma.
When the Hamptons returned to Los Angeles in 1982, John was ill with cancer and unable to run the worn-down theater. John Hampton died in 1990. Dorothy Hampton continued to live alone in the tiny apartment above the darkened theater until an old friend offered to refurbish and reopen the rundown building. Kira Phillips is a local Los Angeles TV news reporter.
Laurence Austin started working there early on as a projectionist, and he became very close with John and Dorothy.
Diana Carey, known as Baby Peggy when she appeared in silent pictures, was also a close friend of the Hamptons.
They had met him when he was 19, attending school at Fairfax High School across the street from where they built the theater. And he became just a kind of an errand boy for them and a good friend. And so for years, from 42 until 91, they had known each other.
Larry Austin was a lot like John and Dorothy in that his life from an early age, became consumed in films. But not just the movies, silent movies.
By 1991, the little piece of real estate on Fairfax Avenue became valuable property. Dorothy Hampton's remaining relatives urged her to sell the building and the land it sat on and pocket the cash. But Laurence Austin had another idea.
Laurence wanted to know what we were going to do here, and I said, well, if you can do anything with that theater over there, why, we'll try opening it again or something. So this is a result, all this beauty and all this, the curtains and the Orient, and all the other things are his ideas.
Dorothy gave Austin complete control of the theater. Just before the theater reopened, the 68-year-old Austin described the renovation in this television interview.
It was about 5 months' work. I had friends that volunteered work, you know, to do the work and materials and so forth, you know. So we had to do it all the way completely, you know, paint the inside, outside, put up new curtains. It's been a very thorough job.
On January 18th, 1991, the silent movie theater opened, and Laurence Austin became a Hollywood attraction.
Good evening. Welcome to the world's only silent movie theater.
Larry was a hero to the people in the silent film community. And then there was this steady stream of aficionados of the silence, you know, old people, young. It was really a mixed crowd, but it all revolved around him. He became the place with his personality and gave it a flair, and was highly regarded.
During the reconstruction of the theater, 68-year-old Austin met 28-year-old James Van Sickle, a young man who became his friend, business partner, and constant companion.
James Van Sickle started to help Laurence with the theater after they met, and he was a projectionist. He started helping him with paperwork and accounting, and pretty soon it became sort of public that they were a couple.
It was a very strange relationship. In fact, those around Larry couldn't understand it. It was such a violent love-hate kind of thing.
Violent enough for Laurence to call the police several times between 1991 and 1996. But Austin never pressed charges. On the eve of the 6th anniversary of the theater's reopening, 34-year-old James Van Sickle was operating the projector when a young man left the auditorium and headed for the lobby. Moments later, Laurence Austin was shot dead.
No one screamed. Everybody just instinctively got down, and then, almost as if scripted, a customer comes through the curtain into the theater lobby and screams, "Mr. Austin's been shot."
Like an old-fashioned murder mystery, there's more to this story than meets the eye. Next up, the cops investigate the murder, discover incredible facts about the victim, and interrogate the con man behind the hit. On January 17, 1997, owner Laurence Austin was shot in the lobby of the silent movie theater while handing cash to an armed robber. But the gunman left the loot behind when he made his dramatic exit. Detective Alan Hamilton was one of the first investigators to arrive at the scene.
Within the first 48 to 72 hours, we determined that there was a distinct possibility that robbery was not the motive.
Maybe that's because the thief didn't steal anything. Meanwhile, Austin's 34-year-old companion, James Van Sickle, took every opportunity to air his grief in public.
And how much money will you need to get it going again?
Not really much. Basically, what money is needed is for the legal costs right now.
What's your favorite memory of Laurence Austin?
His love for cats. He loved cats.
Real cat?
Real cats. And when a cat died of his, it was the full burial at the cat cemeteries.
James Van Sickle immediately comes to all the cameras and comes to the police and says, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe he's been shot. There's got to be justice, and we have to find the murderer."
James Van Sickle was probably the most helpful person that night. He was determined to bring this killer to justice and give the police department whatever assistance they needed.
Standard operating procedure in a murder case is to investigate the victim. And when the cops looked into Laurence Austin's life, they found more than one skeleton in the closet.
It was his entire past, who he said he was, his parents. So he never really revealed himself.
My mother worked for Cecil B. DeMille. That was for 30 years. And my father was in the business as an actor. So I just grew up around Hollywood, you know, seeing the stars and being around and all that.
Of course, none of it was true. Larry never got along with his father. In fact, Larry's mother sort of served as his protector even into his 20s. Larry didn't leave home until he was in his 40s.
But that's not the whole story.
In the early 80s, at a real estate office, Larry Austin had been caught taking cash from his employer and to the tune of $40,000, and was subsequently tried and convicted and served 2 years in prison for it.
So how did Laurence Austin convince the 80-plus Dorothy Hampton to simply give him everything she and her husband struggled a lifetime to build? LAPD Financial Crimes Unit detectives Dave Harnett and Shayo Reyes were brought in to examine the new lead in the case.
After Dorothy had suffered a stroke and was placed in a convalescent facility, that was when Mr. Austin had approached her within the facility and had her sign documents giving complete ownership of the theater, including the movies, bank accounts, everything.
It was just a verbal agreement at the beginning. Dorothy trusted him like a son, and he told her, don't worry, I'll take care of you.
Once John passed away, Laurence, I think, felt an obligation, so to speak, to help Dorothy continue the operation of the theater, and in fact come in the early 1990s, late 1980s and rehabilitate the theater. I think that there was certainly a strong financial incentive there for him to become involved in the theater, you know, in view of its size, the worth of the property, and the value.
I think that she felt she'd sacrificed so much of her life to this cause of film, and that John had lost his life practically in that cause, that whatever that property was worth, it had to be saved. And I think there's no question she trusted Larry Austin.
Actually, it's the kind of thing you wouldn't want to get into unless you had loved silent films, because it does entail a lot of work, you know.
Whether or not Larry coerced Dorothy is the $64,000 question. In my view, he didn't need to coerce her. It only took, you know, a smidgen of enthusiasm on his part, and she would have followed him to the ends of the earth.
Laurence Austin wasn't the only character in this cast with a dicey past.
Van Sickle had served a number of years in a California state prison for a prior attack on a companion who he had stayed with for a period of time, and the result of that relationship was a conviction for attempted murder.
In the weeks after the murder, police worked the streets while James Van Sickle worked the television cameras.
We lost an individual that was dedicated to preserving the silent movies, the birth of the industry, and he's gone. I mean, he was a one-of-a-kind, and it's hard to explain.
We did determine that as recently as 1995 and 1996, Mr. Van Sickle had arranged to be the beneficiary in the event of Mr. Austin's death. All the while, we were determining that he probably was the person behind the murder.
In a confusing case, two things become clear. One, Laurence Austin acquired the silent movie theater and all the assets from Dorothy Hampton under questionable circumstances. And two, James Van Sickle was in line to inherit the motherlode. Coming up, the trigger man becomes a target, and Van Sickle's behavior gets a bit Van Psycho. 2 weeks after the murder at the silent movie theater in Hollywood, police had uncovered Laurence Austin's criminal past. Suspicions had also been raised about Austin's companion, James Van Sickle, but the shooter was still unknown. To help their search, police offered a $25,000 reward. The plan was to buy information leading to the arrest of the killer.
Today, the City Council passed my motion to have a $25,000 reward posted for any information that might lead to the apprehension and conviction of the perpetrator of this outrageous act of violence.
Through that reward, we were able to determine through an informant that James Van Sickle had attempted to hire a person to commit a murder for hire as early as December of 1996.
James Van Sickle became the prime suspect. Police knew he had a violent past, but they still needed a motive. When the chatty Van Sickle volunteered to talk with investigators, he finally talked too much.
I asked him if I could video the interview, since he was a witness regarding the financial operations of the silent theater. And while he's pulling out documents regarding the finances and the corporation. He pulled out documents.
Do you have the will with you? I have a copy of it. Oh, may I see it? Yeah, sure.
And it turned out to be the holographic will from Laurence Austin, leaving everything, the theater, the silent movies, as well as the bank accounts, to Mr. Van Sickle.
The bottom line is he wanted to take control and take over that entire show and control the money.
You didn't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure this thing out. It looked like Van Sickle hired someone to kill Laurence Austin, and at some point, Van Sickle was going to have to give the murderer his money.
The best way to see if James Van Sickle was going to pay this hitman off was to release money from him. We had pretty much frozen up any money that he had a chance of getting. We arranged to have James Van Sickle come down to Parker Center and have the money released to him. We're waiting for him to make his move, basically, and we're watching.
Van Sickle was under 24-hour surveillance, and the LAPD was determined to get their man.
They tapped his telephone, and they learned very quickly that he was corresponding with Christian Rodriguez, the 19-year-old triggerman.
This was not a guy with a rap sheet that went back 30 years and had gotten away with murder and spent hard time. He was a young kid who needed quick cash. He had a little boy. He had a wife.
We recovered a message on the message machine of Christian Rodriguez, of James Van Sickle stating the day that he obtained the money, hey, I've got something for you. You know, you need to get in contact with me. Well, he certainly did have something for me. He had $10,000 in cash.
That was already bad news for Rodriguez because Van Sickle promised Rodriguez 30 grand for the job. But with the cops closing in, James came up with a new plan. Hire a hitman to kill the hitman.
Right around the time we were planning on wrapping it up, we obtained additional information from an informant that Mr. Van Sickle had been making some statements in various areas throughout the city that he may need someone else killed. So we arranged to have an informant introduced to James Van Sickle and obtain incriminating statements through a body wire.
Van Sickle wanted Rodriguez dead, and the cops got it all on tape. Now they had evidence that would hold up in court. On March 8, 1997, the police made their move.
James Van Sickle was subsequently arrested immediately following the conversation with the informant.
Thanks a lot, buddy. I'm busted.
One day later, Christian Rodriguez was also taken into custody just 2 months after Laurence Austin was shot and killed. Up next, the trial, the verdict, and the sound of change at the silent movie theater. In March of 1997, a little less than 2 months after the shooting at Hollywood's silent movie theater, police arrested 2 men for murder. One was Christian Rodriguez, the accused triggerman. The victim's lover, James Van Sickle, was charged with contracting the hit.
Everybody was really shocked when it came out that Van Sickle had hired Mr. Rodriguez to kill Laurence Austin, and that the whole thing was a setup.
Apparently they had a long-time love-hate relationship, and they got along like cats and dogs, to the point that they had to live under separate roofs. But they did continue to work together. He needed him as a projectionist, and I guess Van Sickle needed the theater. It was probably his only income.
Based upon the evidence that came in this trial, it is clear that James Van Sickle wanted to inherit the estate.
After nearly 2 years of delay, the murder trial of James Van Sickle and Christian Rodriguez began before separate juries on January 4th, 1999.
Prior to the murder, the actions that James took following the murder, the tape with the informant, we brought all of those things in, and we wanted to impress upon the jury that this was in fact a case where, regardless of Laurence Austin's past, James Van Sickle had the intent, the motive, and the means to hire a person to come in and kill Mr. Austin and obtain his assets.
The date of the murder, at 3:45 in the afternoon, he pages them again. You can take a look at this inside. The stipulation we entered into is that these are true and correct records, and it'll show you the contact. And then there are a number of times calling after the murder, and you'll see that. All this activity right around the time of the murder. All of this points to Chris as the shooter here.
The Rodriguez jury reached a verdict in 1 day. The Van Sickle panel took almost a week. Both men got life for Austin's murder and 37 years for the failed attempt on the concession girl. Despite the conviction, James Van Sickle remained defiant.
To this day, he has refused to acknowledge his actions in this murder. At the time of his arrest, he refused to acknowledge it. Subsequent interviews with myself, Detective Miller, and Captain Sanchez, he refused to admit his involvement. And to date, he has never admitted to me any involvement in this murder.
James Van Sickle was like the great manipulator. Not only did he affect Laurence Austin's life, Dorothy Hampton's life, but even the young kid, Mr. Rodriguez, who he hired to kill Laurence Austin.
In May of 1999, the silent movie theater was bought by a new owner with plans to reopen the tiny cinema. The silent films were sold at auction, and the proceeds were used to pay for Dorothy Hampton's medical care. Many of the films were donated to the UCLA Film Archive. I'm A.J. Benza. Join me next time Tinseltown loses its glitter on Mysteries and Scandals.
We lost an individual that was dedicated to preserving the silent movies, the birth of the industry. And he's gone. I mean, he was a one of a kind, and it's hard to explain.